Well, good morning, everybody. And it looks like most of you have had your cup of coffee, so that's a good thing. Now, Pat's title of her talk is 50-Year Perspective on the Conservation of the American Goshawk. But this 50 years also marks when she first came to a raptor research conference in 1973 with Jim Anderson, and many of you probably remember Jim. So that she's been a long-standing member of raptor research, and she's been a contributor in the scientific literature extensively on publishing on a number of different topics, but goshawk is primarily one of them. She spent 10 years at Colorado State University as a professor teaching there and getting graduate students going in their careers, which is great. Then she moved over to Oregon State University out of La Grande in Eastern Oregon, and she retired from OSU and still lives there in the area. Her husband's a helicopter pilot, but he's retired. I was asking if she spent a lot of time in his helicopter flying around. But very importantly, she was a member of the Goshawk Scientific Committee put together by the U.S. Forest Service back in the 90s, early 90s. And that's when the goshawk became quite an issue around the logging of forest lands in the western United States. And the scientific committee developed a approach to how to protect the northern goshawk. Pat was instrumental on the committee, providing advice and guidance and that sort of thing. So it was great. So anyway, besides being a Hamerstrom award, she's a great friend. So Pat, thank you for being willing to talk to everybody.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. And I'd like to thank, first of all, I want to thank the Hamerstrom Committee for giving me this award list. So I was honored to have this award, and I'm honored to be here. And I really thank Rob for inviting me, and Joan, and for Joan and Rob for running this wonderful meeting. I've been giving papers at RRF. Sandy said, this is showing my age. Sandy said that I started coming in 1973, and then I started giving papers at RRF in 1976. And you'd think after all these years, I wouldn't be nervous as heck, but you're very daunting. As Scott said yesterday, it's very daunting to get up here when you know like half the people in the audience. This is the whole, and many of you have seen many of these slides before. So yeah, so I'm going to hopefully get less nervous here in a couple slides. What I want to do to get started, I need to explain this title. The 50 years is just, I started my love affair with goshawks when I was 20, and I'm now 70, so that's the 50 years. There's nothing significant to that. The American goshawk, now that's a different, the title when I gave it to them was Northern Goshawk. And even though I'm going to give you a historical perspective, I want to start with something that's hot off the presses. Let's see, how do I do this? Yeah. So we have a new species, right? So in 2023, the American goshawk was separated from the Eurasian goshawk this year. And so those of you who are tickers, you get another species. They found through, yeah, so this is good. So the Eurasian is closely related really to old world goshawks and not to our goshawk. And it reverses, they were lumped in 1957 and now they're split again. And it was split based on data on vocalizations, morphology, and mitochondrial DNA. This picture, let's see if I can do this pointer. Hold on. So just to show you the morphology, there's quite a bit of evidence that the banding on the breasts is very different in the Eurasian goshawk, and this shows that difference. This is the Apache subspecies in the goshawk, and see how this is the extreme. It's very light, and this is very darkly banded. So there's some morphology differences, and also, of course, to have speciation these days, you have to have mitochondrial DNA, and there's good evidence for that. The Eurasian is a vagrant in North America, and then this has just been published in the AOU checklist supplement. So that's hot news for those of us working on goshawks, and it can have a lot of effect on the status of the bird. I can't tell you what that'll be, but it might change things. It might shake things up a bit. And so this is what the range maps look like now. If you look at this map, this also reminds me of probably what our foreign policy will look like if Donald Trump wins the election. But aside from that, but this is now the two species, right? Okay. So I'm now, let me start with the history. I've just given you current and I'm backpedal a little bit. Can you still hear me? Mike, can you hear me back there? Okay. So I was in graduate school in the 80s and early 90s, and that was the era of the northern spotted owl. That was right after biology was dominated by that. The spotted owl was listed in 1990 as threatened, and the status was upheld by in 2004. And so because of the spotted owl, and the spotted owl was an old growth forest. We knew we had good evidence it was an old growth forest obligate, right? And it was based on this decline in virgin forests historically. I wish I had a map to show you this lower, let's see. This map is the oldest one I found of the acreage of virgin forest in the US, and this is from 1992. It'd be great to look at this currently. But anyway, the obvious implication of this is the owl was tied to virgin forests, and virgin forests have declined dramatically in the US over time. So then what happens? So the spotted owl gets listed, and then all these other forest dwelling birds start to be looked at as species of conservation concern. And the American goshawk came up on everybody's radar. It nests and hunts in mature forests, and it's declining. The question was it also declining due to timber harvest? And I was a PhD student during this time and working on this bird. It was a pretty exciting time, actually. And at that time, goshawk management was best reflected in this slide. In the 1980s and early 90s, all that was done is the nest tree might be protected. So this picture is of a goshawk nest tree on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, where the timber industry was happily nuking Vancouver Island. And at that time, the only thing you could do to get a nest protected was to restrict activity around the nest tree, and then you might be able to get breeding season restrictions. And the important point here is the focus was on the nest tree, but not on managing goshawk landscapes. And then the litigation started. So what happened is in 1990, there was a formal request to the Forest Service Region 3 to suspend timber harvest, all timber harvest, because of the goshawk. And Region 3 is this region, the Southwest region. So we're talking about all New Mexico and Arizona forests. And Region 3 then, to deal with this petition, established, the Goshawk Scientific Committee. And as Sandy said, I was finishing my doctorate at that time, and I was on goshawks in the Jemez Mountains outside of Los Alamos. And I was asked to be an advisor on the Goshawk Scientific Committee, which was a terrific honor, and it was a career-changing experience for me. And I'm going to talk more about this, what we produced and how it affected goshawk management here in a minute. But it changed the way I viewed rafter management and forest management entirely. So the committee was set up, and then the petitions were, they were filing, basically, the conservation community was filing to list the goshawk west of the 100th meridian based on known in quotes habitat associations. And then in 1992, the committee published the what's going to be referred to as the Reynolds et al. Goshawk guidelines. And I'm going to describe those for you in a minute. And then for a decade, there was an amazing amount of litigation, but ultimately the petitions to list were considered to be not warranted. So the bird was never listed. Now these management guidelines, I want to mention that, so there are a lot of people who were on this. I got the opportunity to work with excellent biologists like Rich Reynolds. Rich led the committee, he chaired it. He took the lead on writing these guidelines. Sandy Boyce was on it, and Hildy Reiser, and they brought a lot of collective knowledge to this discussion, to development of this document. And then I particularly loved interacting with Russ Graham, who's a research silviculturalist with the U.S. Forest Service. And we had amazing conversations on how to develop guidelines. This was brand new. And there was not a lot of data on the goshawk. So we basically wrote it was based on expert knowledge. This is an expert knowledge document. This was focused on the Southwest. And the objective was to manage nesting goshawk home ranges. So this is 1992. And we were trying to manage the species before it got listed. We weren't trying to avert a listing, but we were trying to come up with a management guideline that would help manage the goshawk to prevent any potential declines. And the assumption was that the goshawk was a population barometer of its prey populations. And so the plan was designed to create forest structures for 14 common prey species. And it focused on the Southwest forests. So we're looking at ponderosa pine habitat. Lots of goshawk in the Southwest and lots of timber. But this thing could be used as a template for other regions. So what do goshawks eat? What are we talking about? These 14 critters, they basically are forest generalists. They'll eat a wide variety of forest birds and small mammals. And what we did, which was kind of unique at that time, is we were trying to manage this home range. Let's see if I can push this back a little bit. I feel like I'm on top of the computer. And so here's the nest tree, which has been the focus of goshawk management and most raptor management at that time, right? And then we developed guidelines for the nest area, which was a 12-hectare or 30-acre region, the structure around the nest tree. And then there was the post-fledgling area, which I'll talk about in a minute, which was somewhat of my contribution to this committee, which is, and then the foraging area. And this was the area that we were trying to figure out how to come up with a management guidelines to manage this landscape. The post-fledging area was an area, goshawks have alternate nests, and that this would cover where the fledglings would hang out and also would protect or manage the habitat that contained all of the alternative nests. And the data that we had at the time was based on average inter-alternative nest distances of 400 meters, which was from 3 study areas. And the range, though, could be from 20 meters to 2 kilometers. And then finally, for the landscape, the foraging area, so what we came up with basically for the Southwest was to buffer the 30-acre nest stand. And I want you to hold on to that because that was a big change. Even the spotted owl, well, anyway, that was just a big change, but to buffer the nest stand and then to manage the rest of the landscape with these proportions of different habitat types to support these prey populations. And this was very controversial, as you can imagine. When it hit the press, it allowed for selective timber harvest. We did not believe that I still believe this, that goshawks can handle some level of harvest. They don't need to be protected from all harvest, but it also allowed trees to grow older. We were calling for longer rotations so that you'd have more older age forests present in the landscape. So, as a result, we knew we were on the right track because everybody hated it. So the conservation community was really mad that we were going to allow for timber harvest, and the industry could not believe that we would let 200-year-old trees stay on the landscape. So we knew we hit it on the head here. And anyway, one thing I want to mention about this, what was really unique for me is, so we were trying to create what we call desired forest conditions, which I had really no background in. And I remember these amazing conversations with Russ Graham, who would lead them, and we would be drinking wine or whatever we were doing. And Russ would ask questions like, okay, we can do this. What are the desired forest conditions for a goshawk? And what you come up with as biologists, we can create those as silviculturists. And I was like, what? nature can only create these. And there was a lot of dialogue about this, and it was an amazing set of discussions for me to think about creating landscapes and this had a huge effect on the rest of my career, actually. I did a lot of work later in life on restoration ecology, novel ecosystems, and those early conversations in this committee had a big influence on my approach to managing landscapes, but that's just an aside. But Russ was hugely pivotal in this. We set this up as a template for the Southwest. We had asked other forests to take this and use it and develop the same guidelines and then manage goshawks throughout its range in the US and Canada. Let's see what else I'm forgetting. I think that's it. Okay, so that's the guidelines in a nutshell. Oh no, I have one more. So what happened is they were at this time, it was required in all forest plans in Arizona and New Mexico. And what am I doing that time? Okay. Oh, no, what did I start at? I didn't start at 8, did I? Oh, thank God. I have a tendency to talk too long and tell too many stories, but I thought, oh my God, I'm in 45 minutes. Okay. All right. The management guidelines. So they were required in all forest plans by the Forest Service in 1996. They were inconsistently implemented throughout North America, but they were recommended to be used in all forests in North America. The guidelines were really a hypothesis. There wasn't a lot of data at the time. It was a lot of expert knowledge. So that they weren't well tested at this time. But it was a start at proactive raptor landscape management. That, I think, was its major contribution. So there was a plan. And then there was a commitment from the Forest Service in the US to manage for goshawks, which greatly influenced the listing decision to not list the bird. So that's where we were in the mid-90s. So then I decided, so I'm a new assistant professor at CSU. I'm working with these, my fellow faculty were Gary White, David Anderson, and Ken Brown. And I was in the middle of, really doing a lot of demography. And so I just thought, okay, we're still arguing over listing. There's still litigation going on. I wanted to know, was there any evidence for this list petition? Did we have any evidence? So I did a demographic analysis of all the literature. And this, I reviewed unpublished and published literature. I included Europe in this time because it was considered the same species. And I had I should say, I had no money for this. It wasn't any grant. And I had an undergraduate named Sammy Rayro, who was marvelous, helping me track down all the unpublished data. So what I did was, basically, I published this paper in JRR, and there was no evidence that the goshawk was declining anywhere. There was no demographic data on this bird. And my conclusions were that the goshawks weren't declining, or they were declining, but wasn't detected with current sampling. And I'd like you to hold on to that thought, that we had a type 2 error. And that what was happening was there was a kind of misapplied advocacy. So there was no beef. There was no beef. There was a lot of, hypothesis, but there was no beef. All right. And then in TWS and RRF put a committee together to review the 1998 Forest Service listing decision to not list the goshawk. And this was a committee with a lot of very well-known people in RRF. And David Anderson chaired this committee. And they concluded that there was not enough data, there was no sufficient data to estimate population trends, no evidence of a unique population west of the 100th meridian. That was the push, was to list the western population, not any of the goshawks in the Northeast. And that goshawk habitat relationships were not well understood, and that assessing goshawk status with distribution of late successional forests was not appropriate. So that was where we were at the end of the 90s. The current status of the bird is a species of special concern for the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and for many states. It's protected under the Migratory Bird Act. The Langii subspecies in British Columbia was listed as threatened in Canada in 2013, and the IUCN lists the goshawk as a species of least concern. So then there was a decade of a lot of goshawk research. I know this is a Pat-centric talk, but that's what you do in plenaries. But anyway, there were a lot of other people working on this bird, and many of them are in this room. We had a lot of good habitat data collected. There are a lot of great habitat studies, but the data were still equivocal. If you look at that body of literature, there hasn't been a formal meta-analysis on this particular question, but you still couldn't, it was hard to, you couldn't tell if the bird was an old growth obligate versus a flexible user of seral stages, which was the assumption of the goshawk management guidelines. So it still was equivocal. We could, by this time, by the early 2000s, we could monitor, we had a mechanism for monitoring population trends. We had solid survey methods. I know many of you in this room hate me and Dale Stoliker for developing the broadcast surveys, but they work. And then there were dawn vocalizations. There are a lot of other surveys that were available at this time. So, and then brilliantly, Christina Hargis and Brian Woodridge published this paper that showed how you could monitor trends in occupancy at large spatial scales using these survey methods. And they were incorporating probabilistic sampling so that detection probabilities could be used, and you could get estimates of abundance. So occupancy is an index of abundance if it's done under probabilistic sampling. So you could get trends in abundance. And then also at that time, Richard Reynolds was working on the Kaibab Plateau, did a 20-year study using mark and recapture techniques. He learned, it was a terrific study, but they concluded that that population has been stable over a 20-year period. But it also demonstrated that with a lot of resources, you could monitor population trends using mark and recapture methods. Okay, so that's kind of where we were. And then I thought I had moved to OSU. I was doing a lot of other different things. And at that time, Tim Parker, a colleague of mine at Whitman College, which is a small college in Washington, and Tim is a behavioral ecologist, not a raptor biologist. He called me up and said, I have this undergraduate who has to do a senior thesis named Sabrina Rodriguez, and she wants to do a goshawk project for her senior thesis. So this is this is about 20, let's see, we published this in 2016. So this was starting in 2014. And Tim was a master at meta-analyses, and I knew this. And so I asked him if Sabrina had great quantitative skills. And he said, yep. I said, could she do a meta-analysis of the literature? And he goes, if we guide her, she can do it. And I thought, great, because I wanted to do this. So what we did is Sabrina in her senior thesis conducted a meta-analysis of the goshawk literature and asked these questions. Does timber harvest affect goshawk nest area? So we focused on the nest area because the literature was consistent with data for that spatial scale. Nest area occupancy and or productivity, and does tree size in the vicinity of nests affect goshawk territory occupancy and or productivity? And she did a meta-analysis of literature range-wide again, because Europe was still connected with the US. And we needed European data because we did not have enough data in the US. So we had about 25 studies that qualified, which was just barely sufficient to do a meta-analysis. And we concluded that the data show that goshawk territories with less timber harvest and larger trees were more likely to be occupied. But if they nest near timber harvest, reproduction was unaffected. We had no impact, but there was a big impact on occupancy. Well, this was not mechanistic. It was just a meta-analysis. The why is unknown, but we speculated in the paper that was published in Forest Ecology and Management that harvest lowers food availability and or increases nest exposure, and that this disturbance impacts the decision to nest. And what we mean by that, okay, let me back up, sorry. But the implications now were from this, that the populations of goshawks may need, range-wide, may need more protection from timber harvest than they're currently receiving. So what I want to get back to, I am fairly convinced this is the mechanism. I cannot prove it, I'm speculating, but I think this critter, once if they're going to be impacted, you're going to see it in occupancy. If there is a problem with the habitat during courtship, that's evaluated and they will not nest. But once they commit to nesting, they can raise young. And so I actually really believe that monitoring reproductive success alone in goshawks is not a good metric of how they're doing. I think occupancy is the key metric, but that's my opinion and I have no evidence for that. So but I'm up here, so I'll say that. Okay, then, okay, good. I'm doing fine. Okay, time wise. Oh, I can talk for hours on this, so you would kill me. So I'm doing good. So then now what I want to do is I want to briefly describe my newest project on goshawks, which I title asking, am I, okay, no problem. I haven't kicked it yet. So thank you. This is in press in Journal of Raptor Research, Brueggemann et al. The title of the talk is the U.S. Forest Service managing goshawks, but that's why I'm on this team. I wanted to know after that, are they being managed outside of the Southwest and in other regions? And we got the opportunity to explore this question. Well, I'll describe this. Let's see if I got this up here. So we got the opportunity to describe this on the Black Hills National Forest. For those of you who are not from the U.S., let me do this. So this is the Black Hills is the forest. It's located in Wyoming and South Dakota. So this is the Wyoming and South Dakota line, and this is the forest. Basically, it's in two segments. And I hope you know where Wyoming and South Dakota are. South Dakota will become famous because it might supply Trump's running mate, the governor of South Dakota, not because of the Black Hills. I'm sorry, I'll stop with the political jokes. It's because anyway, okay, never mind. I have to do this because I have a lot of concern about the election. Okay, I have to make jokes. All right. So the team, so this was a wonderful team of people to work with. So Jason Brueggemann was my postdoc. He worked with David Anderson and I. He had done the postdoc. He had finished this RFP for this grant, which I'll describe this, came out from South Dakota to work on this. And he called me up, and I'm retired from OSU at this time. I'm like in my last year. I'm kind of, heading towards looking at lots of travel plans and things like that. And he says, "You want to work on this?" And I said, and I thought, okay, well, we'll write the proposal. We'll never get the grant, yada, yada. Okay, so here we are. So we get the grant, and it was great. And the other people that worked on this, so David Anderson worked on this, and then our other co-authors are Shelley Deesh and Eileen Dowd-Stuckel with South Dakota Parks. So this South Dakota Parks put out this RFP and it's a nice grant, and they were concerned over the changes in nesting habitat and population viability in the Black Hills. South Dakota, the goshawk is a species of greatest conservation need. It's a U.S. Forest Service Region 2 sensitive species. And so they put this out, but the U.S. Forest Service was very cooperative. We had good cooperators on this. And so I'm going to briefly describe, I don't have a lot of time to talk about all the modeling. And I hate describing lots of modeling, so I'm going to keep this short. If you're confused, just talk to me after I finish. But anyway, the Black Hills has lots of potential great goshawk habitats, ponderosa pine, lovely stuff. The forest is 622,000 hectares, and these are just pictures of the potential habitat that's available for goshawks in the Black Hills. But timber harvest is the primary habitat-related management activity on this forest. And I want to point out that in 1999, for example, 577,000 cubic meters were harvested, and by 2017, they had upped it to 741,000 cubic meters. And their allowable sale quantity, which is what's in their management plan, which is what they say they're going to harvest annually, was at 512,000. So there was a 30% increase in harvest here over this period, and they are I'll get ahead of myself, but they're way over harvesting this forest. Okay, in addition to that, they've had recent large stand replacing fires like most ponderosa pine forests in North America. And they've had huge outbreaks of mountain pine beetle. Greater than 8.6 million trees were killed in that 17-year period, similar to other ponderosa pine forests. But the key here is that allowable sale quantity that the Forest Service comes up with did not account for any of these natural disturbances that were now happening very frequently on the landscape. And Russ Graham and his colleagues published experimentation GTR that called a spade, that the Black Hills were doing an unsustainable harvest. So we come into this, and they're in the middle of all this, and we're asking questions: are they managing goshawk habitat? So on top of everything else they're dealing with, but this is a perfect place to do a study like this, because you've got goshawks in habitat that's under a lot of timber harvest. So if you're going to see effects, you would see it in something like this. So this is just the perfect place to explore these changes. So what did we do? The project objectives were to look at abiotic and biotic factors that were associated with goshawk nesting habitat suitability. We also really wanted to look back at the spatial scale question that developed during the Reynolds et al. Guidelines. What spatial scale best describes habitat suitability for goshawks? At what scale should we be operating on when we're describing habitat? We had the opportunity to quantify changes in habitat suitability over a large space and a long time period, which I'll talk about. And then to look at the effect of these anthropogenic activities and natural disturbances. I don't have time to go over the results of that, but we did look at that. And then the big idea was to create maps of the forest of goshawk suitability and provide that to the Forest Service to use for future management planning. We developed a spatially explicit model of goshawk habitat suitability. We used the legacy data set of the wildlife biologists. This is a data set. The wildlife biologists have been collecting and monitoring goshawks for decades. We had data from 1965 to 2019, so it's a long time period. We had 281 nest locations. These are very messy data sets. I avoided these like the plague throughout my whole career. And when I was faced with having to deal with this, I thought, oh my God, how are we going to use these data? Actually, and I'm going to make a plug at the end of this talk that these are wonderful data sets to work with, and everybody should be doing this because you can glean a lot of information from them. But anyway, they're messy. I'm going to leave it there. We figured out ways to deal with the messiness, and then we were able to combine those nest site location data with time series of remotely sensed data, which are available now and were not available to us in the 90s. So we could look at remotely sensed data on timber harvest, disturbances, anthropogenic infrastructure like roads, topography, and then all the forest attributes. We evaluated the attributes across 5 spatial scales that were relevant to goshawks from the nest tree to foraging area. We developed competing conditional logistic regression models in R, and we used AIC to rank and select models. And then, Jason, I like this. We took the top models and then we would calculate odds ratios from the covariates in the top models. And we had a quantitative measure of habitat suitability. I'm not going to describe what odds ratios are, but they're a probability of a goshawk nest being on the landscape given the covariates that were in the top models. It was great, and we could then estimate quantitatively habitat suitability for goshawks on every pixel and on this landscape. And then we assessed the predictive capability of the models, which we had to do because this data set was very messy, and they have excellent predictive capability. We use concordance statistics for that. Okay, I'm going to talk about a few key results. I'm going to hammer on this a lot because I'm convinced we're over focusing on nest trees. But we found the models demonstrate that the best predictive model, the spatial scale that best predicts goshawk habitat, is the 12-hectare nest stand scale. And that's the scale, that's where we get the best predictive with this data set. But I think this is relevant, that this is, the nest stand is what should be the sampling unit in goshawk habitat studies, if you're not asking questions about the foraging area. And it's important to manage the nest stand, not just the nest tree, which is something that Reynolds et al. Came up with decades ago. So just a few important results that are not surprising to this crowd. Goshawk habitat suitability at 12 hectares was positively associated with mean canopy cover. Now, we don't know why. We speculate that the more canopy closure there is, there's greater protection from weather, reduced predation risk, and more structure for nests. But we don't, those are what we think are mechanisms, but we don't know that. And then at 12 hectares, again, the mean canopy, the base height of the mean, the distance to the bottom of the canopy was positively associated. And the standard deviation or variation in canopy base height was negatively associated with goshawk habitat suitability. And this is, we think they need a lot of space in this habitat under the crown. We think it's because goshawks fly a lot beneath the canopy, and these are flight paths to access the nest tree. And they have less suitable habitat if there's a lot of variation in the base height. So none of this I know is a surprise to you guys. Topography negatively associated with slope, negatively associated with distance from drainage bottom, positively associated with distance to ridges. I don't understand the topography stuff very well, but it may be related to microclimate. But people see this a lot, topographic relationships, but I can't really explain them. So let me show you some of these maps and work you through them. This is a map of our odds ratios across the Black Hills National Forest. The one on the left is from 1990. We pulled data over decades. The data did not allow us to do annual, but this is 1990 to 2001, and the darker area, the darker it gets, the more suitable the area is. And then this is 2015 to 2019. And what I want to show you, this is a short period of time, but there's a huge change in suitability. So if you look at this area, it's going, and then you look at it over here, it's going way more yellow. And areas like this are becoming way less suitable. There's big changes in the forest attributes and related to goshawk habitat. We've been able to demonstrate huge changes in the forest structure related to goshawk over this period. So we concluded that the forest has lost a lot of its high quality habitat over the past 30 years. The remaining highly suitable habitat will likely decrease in availability due to continued unsustained timber harvest and natural disturbances. And we conclude that the Black Hills is not managing goshawk habitat. And JLR is publishing this in December, and we'll see what happens. But probably nothing, but it's okay. The Forest Service is aware of this. We've been having meetings with them, so this is not a surprise. We've made a bunch of management suggestions. I'm going to go through a few that I think are important for this group. The habitat maps I think are great. I'd like to see the Forest Service use them as a tool for management to assess if harvest activities, to make decisions about where they're going to harvest related to highly suitable goshawk habitat. They can be used to develop. We wrote up in our final report how to do a forest-wide occupant survey based on Hargis and Woodbridge and Jeff Beck. It's work in Wyoming, which I may have failed to mention. I'm sorry. Jeff did a great paper in JWM about this, and to guide restoration activities. And then we recommend they minimize timber harvest activities that decrease canopy cover and canopy base height and the variability in highly suitable habitat. We also really emphasize they should follow their forest plan directives and don't harvest more than their ASQ, never. And then they need to incorporate disturbances into their ASQ. They haven't been doing that. And they're having lots of disturbances. And I think I've been talking to people about how do we go about including climate related disturbances how to integrate those into predictions for what you can harvest, but it needs to be taken into account. I don't know how to do that. So what about this is research implications for this group. I would love to see something like this done with other forests to continue to figure out if we are managing for this bird. And there are many dedicated U.S. Forest Service and state agency biologists who have conducted goshawk monitoring in spite of what their forest is doing. And these data need to be analyzed. They could use our study as a template. One forest would be a great PhD project. There's a lot of value in analyzing these legacy data sets with time series of remotely sensed attributes. And so I would encourage, I am retiring. You probably won't get another talk from me. I hope that I can't do this, but I'd love to see somebody younger and smarter than me work on something like this. There's a lot of value in analyzing these legacy data sets with time series of remotely sensed habitat attributes. And then I was very inspired by the panel yesterday. One of the big things that's been missing from goshawk habitat work is that we have not been collaborating with the local tribes and on any of these studies, anybody's habitat work that I know of. And we need to start collaborating with the local tribes and incorporate their traditional ecological knowledge into our assessment on what's happening to goshawk habitat over the landscape. We need to quit focusing on nest trees and expand our focus to larger landscapes. We still do this. I still read papers, not on goshawks, but I think it's an underfocus on raptors to do that, use that as our sampling scheme. I mean, you have to find the nest tree to help you with these other larger scales, but I think we over focus on nest trees. New approaches to goshawk surveys. I agree that it would be nice to do something else besides broadcast surveys. But before I get to that, Jason and I and David and everybody wrote up in the final report a design for the Black Hills to do occupancy surveys as a citizen science project. And if any of you have done that in this room, I'd love to hear about it. I think it could be done. It would take you couldn't do it the way Scott's Owl project is done, because it would have to, somebody would have to supervise people and train them. But I do think you could get volunteers in a local area to do goshawk surveys, but I could be naive. I really think occupancy surveys with drones and unattended acoustic recorders have potential. I don't know a lot about this. I'm still concerned about the acoustic recorders' accuracy. You know, when you get a hit when you do a broadcast survey, when you get a hit, you have a hit, unless it's a false positive like a J. And if you know what you're hearing, you know it's a goshawk. I'm not convinced that we're there yet with these acoustic recorders, but I could be wrong. I haven't done them, but there have been good talks at this meeting on this. And then there may be other survey approaches up there that need to be done that make this much more, you know, makes it easier and more cost effective. And then I need information on thresholds. The goshawks can tolerate harvest. There was a lovely little paper by Pentariani in the 90s who looked at this in Europe and had a small sample sizes, but he concluded that they could, in Europe, they could handle about a 30% reduction in canopy before they would no longer occupy the area. But we know nothing about thresholds. We do not know when the goshawks are going to abandon, and how much can they tolerate, and what types of harvest practices are tolerated. In this data set for the Black Hills, we could not get good information on whether this was a selective cut, was this a clear cut. We had no information. They just lump everything under timber harvest, which is very frustrating and not very informative. One of the things that could be done, this could be a bad idea, but I think if you had a forest where you had data on red tail nests, I think what happens is in a lot of these areas, as many of you know, when the canopy cover starts decreasing, red tails move in, goshawks move out. I think, but we haven't really, so you could look at this perhaps by quantifying the forest attributes of the red tail nests and the coexisting goshawk, and then get some ideas on when these thresholds occur, when you start to lose one and get the other, and that might inform us. I don't know, it's an idea. And then finally, It's also possible the American goshawk will adapt to forest fragmentation. One of the most interesting examples about this is Berlin, Germany, which is very wooded, very urban, but very wooded. They have 100 pairs of goshawks in the Berlin area. It's the highest goshawk territory density in the world that we know of. And there's a great paper out by De Chapa in the Royal Society a couple years ago that talks about Eurasian goshawks thriving in some urban areas, how they're an urban species, and this they're an urban indicator is what they're being referred to in Europe. Wherever they have, and what happens with them, they've got data on, let's see what, the urban birds, they compared the goshawks in the urban areas to rural areas, and found the urban birds were 21 times more likely to defend the nest from humans than rural females, which would make sense, right? Urban birds laid eggs 12 days earlier and were 2.2 times more likely to produce a brood of greater than 3 nestlings. They have a lot of food, as you can see in that top picture, but they also have lots of trichomonas and window collisions, which are the big mortality. This is a very similar situation to the Cooper's hawks in Tucson that Clint Bow and Bill Mannon worked on. And there's other good examples in their urban raptor book that Clint and Cheryl put together. But the European, now with this new species distinction, the American goshawk is a different critter from the Eurasian goshawk. So who knows? I'm just throwing it out there. And I don't think we should wait to see if this happens, but it might happen. Well, you might get American goshawks nesting in New York City. I don't know. Okay. But with that, I'm going to end. Okay, good job. And I can take questions. Okay, I think, and I've thought for a long time, and I think Richard and Sandy would agree. Oh, sorry. Okay, the question. So I'm assuming you're asking me, what do I think might work for managing the American goshawk, or what changes we might need between the European and the American? Yeah, it's a great question. This is so new, and I'm so grateful that I don't have to stay on top of the Eurasian goshawk literature anymore when I publish, that I didn't think of these bigger questions as much. But because the Europeans are way more prolific on their goshawk than we are. I don't know. Let me back up on this. I do believe that if the Forest Service would commit to implementing the guidelines, the bird would do fine. The general context of protecting the nest areas and managing the foraging areas for a diverse forest habitat, but maintaining old trees on the landscape. That's what will work. So my approach to this is to really try to, I'd like to see the Forest Service do this. Whether they're going to do it, I don't know. Are you asking me whether we should push for a listing? That's the big elephant in the room. There was a lot of effort on goshawks, and there was, and then they've dropped off the radar. You'll see, like at this meeting, there aren't very few goshawk papers. 15 years ago, we would have had whole sessions on goshawks. What's unfortunate, I really thought, and I trusted the Forest Service, I still think we could do this, but in the Southwest, they've done a good job of trying to implement the guidelines. There is commitment in parts of the Forest Service to manage, but what's discouraging is when a species gets off the radar and there isn't a listing petition, we just quit working on it. And I find this approach to management, this crisis management, it's disturbing. I don't know how to get off of this. I am not promoting a listing decision, a listing petition, but I don't know. I do think we know how to manage them. I just think if we could come up with really cheap ways to survey for them, the Forest Service has to commit to one. Okay, let me back. Okay. So one of the things that we recommended in our final report that is hurting us from a data standpoint is these wildlife biologists who are really great and very stressed, because what happens is they get told that a timber harvest is being planned. And then you need to go survey that timber harvest potential area for goshawks, and you've got 3 days to do it, right? That's a common life of a wildlife biologist on it, which these guys are really on the mat. And they really need to design forest-wide sampling of some sort. I think citizen science would work, but so they need better data. They need to have remotely sensed data on what timber harvest is occurring where and when, so that we can use that to answer some of these questions. And then we need to take managing for them seriously. I think the bird is a good indicator of ecological health of these forests. But I know that's a lousy, wimpy answer, but I don't promote another listing, although it would get everybody's attention, but I don't think we have enough data. Yeah, Rob? Increase occupancy after prescribed, yeah. So the question was, have we seen an increase in and reproduction after prescribed burns? There's equivocal data on burns in goshawks. We looked at the burn effect in this. We looked at the burns that are burned in the Black Hills, and short term, the stand replacing fire decreases goshawk habitat suitability by getting rid of the trees. Long term, I think there's some good data, not with us, but with other researchers, that fires will create heterogeneity on the landscape that the goshawk will take advantage of. But the short-term effect of burns is to reduce the canopy, which are major predictors of nesting habitat. Good question. You had a question in the back? Yeah. No, I think in the long term, but short term, there's a negative effect. There appears to be. Yeah. Carol, the other Hamerstrom, another Hamerstrom Award winner. In terms of okay, I'm going to tell a funny story that has been positive. Early in my career, when I would talk to forest supervisors about their approach to managing goshawks, was to save the tree, and I would go talk to them about how ineffective this was probably going to be, and they would just pat me on the head and call me Missy and walk away. So that has changed. That has changed. So I think there's better dialogue. There's more receptivity by agencies. What have I seen? I say yes. I think the younger generation is helping with this. I think they're better with getting these dialogues started, and I think they're helping with the age, but we're still very reactive. We talk a lot, but then we don't do anything. That's probably what I haven't seen change. But there's less, yeah. And the economics are driving Black Hills. Right. Maybe we need a GoFundMe campaign for goshawk surveys. I don't know. That's a good question, Carol. I wish I could be more optimistic, but I'm not. Yeah. Sandy. So that's an interesting, South Dakota Parks was really aggressive about, the biologists are great about this, but many of them have retired in the last 3 or 4 years. They're tired. I have not talked to like the forest supervisor, and we haven't had public meetings on it, but the ball is really in their court on that. I don't feel as a scientist that I could, no, maybe I could, but I don't, organize public meetings, but we haven't heard anything from the upper management yet. So we'll see. It's a good question. Yeah, Jack. There's some better people in this room. Someone answered this who works on acoustic. I sat through Nadia, are you here? Is there some people here that have worked on acoustic? Teton's Raptor Center? I can't answer that. I'm skeptical, but I've never really looked at the data. Christian, are you in here? Can you answer that? Yeah, thank you, Christian. I forgot. I didn't repeat. Sandy's for the Zoom people. Sandy asked me if have we had any feedback from the Forest Service in the Black Hills? That was the first question I forgot to repeat. And the second one was Jack, who asked about the accuracy of acoustic recordings as a mechanism for surveying goshawks. And Christian Hagen thankfully answered that question because I don't have any familiarity with him. Okay. Do I have to repeat that, or does the Zoom people know that? Okay, good. The answer is no. We worked with the data are not out there. Richard has really great data. When you do occupancy monitor, the trade-off between doing mark and recapture and occupancy is that you really don't get a lot of mechanistic data. I mean, you can get abundance. That's the downside of it. Whereas in mark and recapture, and if you read Richard's monograph, excellent monograph, he has a lot. You get survival estimates. You get a lot more information on age class, survival, and reproduction, and you get a lot more biological information, I think, in that system. But so the data were not there. I mean, there were no mark and recapture studies really for the goshawk when we did that. I do want to get back to, however, I think I am a person who is skeptical. I'll say this, I'll probably get into trouble. And with the goshawk, I am really skeptical about monitoring reproductive success by itself. Because I think this bird can, he didn't ask this, so I'm ranting off of this question. But I, for decades, have thought that this bird, if it decides to nest, it will rear young, and you will not see a response in reproduction to a disturbance. You'll just see a reduction in occupancy. So, and it could be this case with a lot of raptors. But in isolation, obviously the survival data is terrific, but in isolation, reproductive success is a lousy metric, I think.